So I'm sitting in my garden in the sun again. Of course, I should, as usual, be doing many other things, but I felt strongly to talk a little bit about one particular point of similarity between the cases of Lucy Letby and the Dutch nurse Lucia de Berk. And it pertains also to Bayesian statistics. Perhaps you remember the sinking of the yacht, the Bayesian theorem, and using probability arguments in courts. Now I'm just turning around, so this time you get a better view, not of me particularly, but of our garden, which is in a state of, well, let's say it's a natural garden, very natural. Very natural. We have a beautiful shed at the back, which is basically collapsing beautifully. It's a ruin. All right. Okay, now I'll sit down, carry on. Yeah, so let me point out two things which to me seem very, very similar in the two cases, and they're in the arguments of judges. The arguments of judges. Judge Goss told the jury that they didn't need to be certain. They didn't need to know, they didn't really need to have any idea how Lucy had killed baby whatever. This was the appeal brought by the prosecution to nail one of the baby where the jury couldn't come to a conclusion in the full trial, in the big trial. So it was like one case unsettled. And Judge Goss actually told jurors that they didn't need to know, I mean, the prosecution didn't need to say how Lucy Letby had murdered that particular child. The fact was that if they believed that the preceding convictions were sound, if they trusted the preceding convictions, then they just didn't need to know that. I mean, implying, of course, that if you believe that she killed all those other babies and attacked all those other babies, all the convictions which at that point stood, all indictments which at that point had been confirmed as turned into convictions, then that was fine. They could go ahead and give a guilty verdict on a further case without really having any idea, not being told any idea about what Lucy had done, and no proof of, of course, no proof of what she had done. But and okay, many people in Britain kind of complained about this. I would say rightfully, but the amazing thing is that in the Lucia de Berk case, exactly the same thing happened, and maybe even in a more subtle, complex way, because such an argument was actually applied by the Dutch court consecutively. Now, in the Dutch case, you had a whole lot of babies, and actually you had accusations of murder and murderous attacks at other hospitals, as well as the Children's Hospital, where everything started. So there was like Amber, who was the last person, the last victim chronologically, the one which actually triggered the police investigations. So first in alphabetical order, you could say, but last in the chronology, most recent in the chronology. And then before that, in time, there had been baby Achraf and baby Ahmed. I'm not quite sure if these were babies or children, but it was a children's hospital. So there were young children. Amber was a baby. She was 6 months old. Ahmed and Achraf were both somewhat older children. Okay, and then it went back in time, and it also went over to other hospitals, to cases in other hospitals. And the further back one went, the less evidence there was, sort of obviously, because all these events at the time had been thought unsuspicious and normal, and if people had died, there'd been post-mortems and natural causes found. So going back, there was actually less and less to say that Lucia had actually done anything. Now, the Dutch judge's argument was essentially this. Let's look at Amber, okay, the last baby, the last victim, chronologically, the most recent victim, chronologically. At some point in the trial, the judges had become convinced that Amber had died of digoxin poisoning, that Lucia had had opportunity and motive to give it. She was the last person who was there with the child. Monitors were switched off at a certain crucial time point, so she could have she could have given the digoxin poisoning without anybody noticing, while the baby was for a few minutes switched off the monitors. Now, much later, we found out that some of these assertions are false. In fact, almost all of them. That was how the case could be overturned, finally. And of course, by overturning the case of Amber, it basically overturned the cases against of all the other victims, because the argument specifically used what had been proven, what was now known from a legal point of view about Amber, to aid the conviction in more cases, going backwards in time down the original list of 14 indictments or whatever it was. Eventually, Lucia was convicted. I mean, eventually, before the campaign to get her retrial started, eventually she was convicted of 10 of the 14 which the prosecution had brought, and the last sort of days or maybe weeks of the trial were actually spent arguing about whether to stop at number 10 or earlier at 9 or 8 or later at 11, 12, 13 or 14. That's what the arguments were, the legal arguments between prosecution and defense were, and where the judges determined that they would draw the line at number 10. Now, the Dutch judges, because it's an inquisitorial system, and the judges are actually running an inquiry, a board of wise judges, learned judges, and okay, of course they are lawyers, they are very knowledgeable in law, highly educated, belong to the elite of Dutch society. Because it's an inquiry, they write out their whole reasoning. They write out the motivation for their judgments. They write it out in full and in as much detail as necessary, and in order to make it impossible for anybody to appeal to it. That's kind of the art of being a Dutch High Court judge, is how to write as a summary of your verdict in such a way that there's absolutely no way that it can be appealed against. Like, it has to be a watertight argument. Disadvantage of the UK system is we don't know what actually swayed the jury most. We have, of course, we have the judges summing up, and the judges also final words when convicting, and maybe possibly sentencing as well. So the judge has, in UK, does write out a motivation for the jury, but it's, well, for the public, but it need not be what actually convinced the jury. It doesn't have to be the reasoning of jury members. I think this is actually not so terribly important, because I mean, jury members will have different motivations from medical experts or lawyers. It doesn't matter. They all have different reasons for being convinced. They all have reasons for being convinced at the end if there is a conviction. And the reasons can well be different. Where was I? Okay, so once it had been established that Lucia de Berk had murdered baby Amber, once it has become a legal fact, it's beyond any reasonable doubt, it's a legal fact. The court now takes this to be a fact, and having taken this as fact implies that we now know that Lucia de Berk is a liar, because she claimed to be innocent. She claimed not to have done those things. We have therefore proven that she's innocent. We have proven that she's a liar. This gives us a great deal of latitude in choosing, in her various utterances, you know, under cross-examination and things she said to the police, so on and so forth. We can choose from them which ones we want to take as being true and which ones we want to take as being lies. This is where the storytelling starts, right? Once you know she's guilty, now we can tell a story explaining why she's guilty, and then we start the cherry picking of all the other little bits of evidence which we want to show as confirming our conclusion, and we leave out the ones which we think don't support it, because we know they don't support it, because we know the truth. So the judges ruled that for the next baby, the next one was a baby or child, a small young child. I forget if it was Achraf or Ahmed. We don't need such hard proof, and the argument is essentially this. Let's look at a case, a fictitious case of a series of murders, horrible murders of prostitutes in the back streets of London in some period, and there have been a number of murders. So there are a number of murders. So that's one assumption. There are murders there, and they are obviously murders. Okay, and they're horrific murders. And they are similar. They are very similar murders. The person in question has been lured into the back street, possibly as part of, business negotiations with a punter, and there they have been gruesomely murdered in the same way again and again. So there are murders, and they are all similar. They have striking similarity. That's the first thing. The next thing is the person whom we know actually committed one of those murders actually happened to be in the neighborhood of one of the other murders when it happened. And they had no reason. They could give no reason for being in that neighborhood. That they were proven by, eyewitnesses or closed circuit television or whatever. We know that same person who killed the other prostitute was actually walking in that same street, in the same street where another one was murdered a few weeks or months before or after, and had absolutely no reason to be doing that. I mean, they didn't work in the neighborhood. They must have, traveled up from God knows where to get to that place in London, and or down from wherever. I mean, they came from a distance to that place, and they could offer no reason for having gone there. No convincing reason. There was no proven genuine reason for them being there. Okay, so is this enough? we have a very similar murder. We have this person, the same person who did commit one of them, also being in the neighborhood with no conceivable plausible reason for being there, except perhaps in order to carry out a similar murder. Should we believe they did it? Well, I think everybody would agree it's very reasonable. It's very reasonable. Now, you can apply that same argument in like in 10 steps in the Lucia de Berk case, starting with baby Amber and then working backwards in time. And as you go further down, you know more and more has been established as legal facts. You have more and more damning information about that person. And you can apply that argument. Now, of course, when you apply that argument, you must verify the, the assumptions, the premises of the argument. Now, one of the premises is that the murders are similar and that they are murders. In the Lucia de Berk case and in the Lucy Letby case, the murders, the alleged murders, were said to be similar in the fact that they were different. Oh my God, I mean, the fact that they were all different, used different poisons or whatever, was evidence for the evilness of and skill of the murderer. So the similarity was that it was very, very difficult to see that this was a murder at all. And it was very, very, very difficult to see how it had been carried out. These were the similarities in the Lucia de Berk case, which carried it all the way. A train, it was like a locomotive pulling a train of wagons. That was the imagery used by the judges to describe what they were doing. That locomotive finally pulled 9 wagons. You know, first pulled a coal tender, and then the next, and then the next, and it got down to number 10. A long train. In the Lucy Letby case, we don't have such an intellectual and carefully structured argument for everything, because of course the last verdict was in a different trial from the verdicts already obtained in the previous trial, so the same judge, and part of the ploy tactics of the prosecution in a case like this is to make so many claims of so many murders and so many murderous attacks that a typical jury will tend to believe a priori that, well, a number of them must be true. I mean, the prosecution doesn't make 25 charges if they're not extraordinarily sure of a couple of them. And so, and where does the sureness comes from? Well, okay, you have all this medical mumbo-jumbo of Dowie Evans, supported by a whole train of further medical experts who presumably have done less and less work in each time, but have just kind of put a seal of approval on what Dowie Evans had done. For instance, after Dowie Evans came Alexandra Bohin. Did she actually go back and look at all the dossiers which went to the police, or did she only receive the dossiers which played a role in the piece of Dowie Evans' expert testimony, which she was called on to verify? I mean, I suppose she read what he had written and felt that it had the ring of truth, and was, then the less she had to do, the more easy it was to earn the money which she would get by approving it. But, I mean, maybe she was just convinced anyway that Lucy Letby was guilty from whatever else she knew or had learnt about the whole thing. and who knows, maybe she's a pediatrician, maybe she's probably already a friend of Dowie Evans, maybe her name was even suggested by Dowie Evans. She probably knows the Countess of Chester pediatricians, because they are quite well known in pediatrics circles. So they will tend to have back channels of communication which make them certain in advance that convictions are going to be just, and that they are doing the world a good service by putting their stamp of approval on the work of one of their fellow experts. And that's how it maybe went some of the way. Okay. Have I said enough now? Yes. So what I want to say is that the chain argument is a perfectly valid argument. It's a valid form of argument, and it's essentially a Bayesian argument. Oh yes, Bayes. Bayes' theorem tells how a rational person should update their degrees of belief in certain competing propositions about the world from what their beliefs were at the beginning, how to update those beliefs, degrees of belief, in the light of receiving new evidence. And the theorem says posterior odds equals prior odds times likelihood ratio. And the prior odds are your reasonable betting odds a priori about a certain issue, when you've been told some, sort of important aspects of the case, giving us some kind of focus, right? I would not start with somebody's been accused of murder, somebody's been accused of serial murder. What's the chance that a random person is a serial killer? I don't think that's a useful place to start. I think it's useful to start with a very clear dichotomy of two things which could be going on, and both of which are possible a priori. And one is another disaster in an NHS maternity unit leading to a spike in deaths, etc., for non-criminal reasons, and a serial killer. My prior odds on those two hypotheses, when I hear that police are investigating a particular nurse in connection with an unexplained spike in deaths at a hospital in England, my prior odds are 50-1. 50-1 that spike of deaths is not caused by a killer nurse, but by a standard NHS scandal in a maternity unit or a neonatal unit. And if you just look at the newspapers, like every year you will find that there has been an appalling spike in deaths at some hospital, and that after sufficient investigation, the cause has been found to be a virus or this or that or whatever, right? I mean, there's like one such event a year. You read all about it in the newspapers. Okay, and it could be a consultant who's botching operations again and again. It could be a virus or a bacteria or a fungal infection. Could be something in the water or something in the air. All of these things, you'll see in the recent years there's been one a year. On the other hand, how many serial killer nurses do we know about over the last years? Well, I mean, we can... Bev Allitt was not even working in a neonatal unit, so she's I would say the nearest we have to one. And how many years ago was that? So I would say, at a conservative guess, I would say there could be a serial killer nurse in a UK maternity unit and neonatal unit, or neonatal unit. Maybe, say, once every 50 years. Okay, we have an NHS disaster once a year. So, a priori, the odds are 50-1 in favour of this being, yet another red herring. I mean, a wild goose chase. There's not a particular nurse responsible for that spike in deaths for criminal reasons. I mean, maybe there's a nurse who's got fingernails which are spreading an infection. Right, that can happen, has been the cause of a spike in deaths in wherever. So that's what I would start with. And from then, the next step, I would say, well, look, police investigate. They investigate for 8 years, and they find no hard evidence. Nothing hard, no hard proof of any criminal activity. The nearest is the suggestion from the immunoassays that 3 babies might have, we now know, might have been given insulin which they shouldn't have been given, weren't supposed to have been given. Of course, they might have been accidentally given insulin because errors are made all the time. So the immunoassays does not prove criminality. And there were 3 of them, and Lucy happened to be there twice, but apparently not the 3rd time. So there are so many other possible reasons for a anomalous C-peptide insulin measured ratio from immunoassay. I would like to remind you that immunoassay was used to show that 2 of Bev Allitt's patients seemed to have received insulin which they should not have had. And Professor Vincent Marks, the teacher of Gwen Walk, one of the prosecution experts, and co-author of a paper with her from 2013, he performed a whole host of supplementary tests which are de rigueur, which are absolutely necessary to rule out any of the multiple innocent explanations for an anomalous ratio insulin C-peptide. And by the way, one of them in our case being that we hardly know anything about what that ratio should be in premature neonates. In neonates, let alone premature neonates. Nobody's done experiments on them, thank heavens. And we basically don't know. So 7 or 8 years of intensive research did not deliver any hard evidence of multiple murders, let alone of one murder, let alone that Lucy Letby had done any. Now we also have, now we must figure out in our mind what is the chance of that being the result of 8 years police investigation. Under each of the 2 hypotheses, we must pretend in our minds that we know Lucy is innocent and that we know it's an NHS catastrophe. What is the chance of not finding proof of a serial murder, killer, nurse? Well, I think it's pretty large. On the other hand, suppose there is a serial killer nurse, for instance, Lucy. What is the chance of not finding any hard evidence for any murder? I think it's pretty small. What is the ratio of those 2 chances? That's the likelihood ratio, also known as Bayes factor. I think it's pretty big. I mean, we have to guess a number. These are subjective probabilities, and a ratio of 2 subjective probabilities. There's subjective probabilities of seeing the things we see, certain things which we do see, under 2 hypothetical scenarios, both hypothetical. we have to put ourselves in both of the two worlds and pretend that we know that the prosecution is right, or pretend that we know that the defense is right, say. And I formulated the two hypotheses as, more specifically, as NHS catastrophe versus, natural NHS catastrophe versus serial killer nurse. I don't even say how many people she killed, but a nurse killing a number of people. And of course we can think of 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 or whatever. Well, then we can look at other pieces of evidence, and we should look at evidence which is in some sense, well, in a sense independent. Well, actually in a sense of independent, in the statistical sense of independent relative to our prior beliefs, to our subjective beliefs, so subjectively independent. Now, I would say that let's look at, alternatively, we can just look at probabilities of that, given what we have got to so far. So having taken account of, having found no hard evidence of a murderous nurse, what should we now, let's look at the next piece of evidence, and it's an absence of evidence. It's evidence for psychopathy, for sadism, for antisocial behavior, for a sick mind, psychological disturbance of a kind which could lead people to go on a murdering spree. What is the probability of finding no evidence for that in the past history, as far as has now been revealed, of Lucy Letby? Under two hypotheses. Under the hypothesis that she's a mass murderer, and under the hypothesis that she's not a mass murderer. Now, I think the probability of not finding any evidence for psychopathy, for sadomasochism in Lucia de Berk's past history, in Lucy Letby's past history, if she's innocent, is obviously pretty big. Most innocent people didn't have a hobby of smashing in the brains of little rabbits when they were a kid, right? And so on and so forth. Most people are not sadists. I don't know, maybe 99%, 95%. You could be pessimistic about this or optimistic about this, but I think most people are not psychopaths. Oh, that's the word I was looking for, psychopaths. Psychopaths or sociopaths. Most people are not. So if she's innocent, it's no surprise that we find no evidence pointing in that direction. On the other hand, if she's guilty, I would be extraordinarily surprised. I would be extraordinarily surprised that one did not dig up some evidence of psychopathy. Yeah. So that's another number. We can take the ratio of those two probabilities. Okay, let's decide, fix on a number, choose a number, 10 maybe, or 100, and multiply it to what we've got so far. And we can add in a few more things. We can add in the statistical evidence that the spike had a natural explanation, the statistical and medical evidence now that those babies had a much higher acuity than the unit was used to, and that the number of babies being admitted was much more than they were used to. We now also have evidence of incompetence of the doctors. We have evidence of motive of the doctors. We know the RCPCH report came. The RCPCH came in, published a report, and we know that the doctors ran to the police because they were scared that because of the report they were going to lose their jobs. This is evidence. It's evidence which makes their medical evidence in court less reliable. They have got an enormous conflict of interest. And of course, the people who accuse a person of a crime should not be taken to be independent scientific expert witnesses. In fact, statistically, the person who accuses somebody else of a crime, the person who reports a crime to the police, statistically is very often the person who actually committed the crime. So they should have been high on the list of police suspects, supposing that there had been babies killed, let us say. They shouldn't have been killed. I'm not saying they were murdered. They could have been killed accidentally, for instance, by doctors, or by unskilled doctors, insufficiently supervised by the doctors who should have been supervising them. Right, this adds another factor to another Bayes factor or likelihood ratio, and this leads me to be 1,000,000 to 1 certain that Lucy Letby is completely innocent. I'm practically speaking certain. Of course, I don't know for sure. I am prepared to act strongly on the assumption that she's innocent, because the chance my action would be wrong is so tiny. It's so tiny. I know it's so tiny. I've explained to you why it's so tiny. However, there's a tiny probability that she's innocent, guilty. Sorry, there's a tiny probability, absolutely tiny. And just like Lucy's good friends, if she would, out of her free will, admit to having murdered some babies and have explained also out of her free will how and why she did it exactly, that would be the most powerful evidence I can imagine. So strong it would overturn my 1,000,000 to 1 current odds that she's innocent. It's so inconceivable that an innocent person would actually know things about how the babies were killed, which are not presently known, but which retrospectively can be verified. For instance, right, a confession is only worth anything. It's only evidence for guilt when it contains knowledge about the crime, which only the perpetrator of the crime can know. Of course, it's useful if the police can know it, but it hasn't been publicly revealed. So, or if it can be verified in some way or other. So if we could verify by some sort of new autopsy that such and such a baby was actually murdered using such and such a poison, and Lucy told us the poison in advance of doing the autopsy, well, that would be strong evidence against her, wouldn't it? But it's reasonable. I think it's reasonable not to expect this to happen. There's no reason to expect it to happen, but that doesn't mean to say it could happen. Could happen that we discovered that the moon landings were faked, and that Hollywood conspired with NASA to fake them, and as a reward, Ronald Reagan, famous Hollywood actor, not such a good one, but still, became president of the United States. Okay, well, that's something which could be true, I suppose. And one can think of some more or less ludicrous things which are believed by some people. So apparently some people think they're not ludicrous, but most people, almost everybody, does. Okay, so this is 40 minutes now, so I'm definitely going to stop now. I hope I actually made the points I wanted to make. The point I wanted to make was that the chain argument is actually a Bayesian argument. It's updating prior beliefs as you obtain successively more pieces of information. The argument, the form of the argument, is a correct form of argument. It is even a mathematical theorem. It can be expressed in a mathematical theorem. The theorem is called Bayes' theorem, and it says posterior odds equals prior odds times likelihood ratio, and it echoes what Carl Sagan used to say. It's that incredible, extraordinary claims need to be supported with extraordinary evidence. Okay, convert that to numbers, and use Bayes' theorem to as a tool for manipulating uncertainties, personal uncertainties, your uncertainty about like what the weather is going to be tomorrow. What would you bet on right now? And what you would bet on right now, you would use to decide whether or not to take an umbrella with you tomorrow, packing for a trip tomorrow, right? I mean, that's what we do all the time. We weigh the odds, we weigh the costs and losses, and we make decisions. That's what we have to do. If we do it rationally, we actually do it conforming to Bayes' theorem. I'm not saying that our prior beliefs are well-founded or rational. They may be irrational, they may be wrong, but if you can write them down and talk about them, you can make them semi-objective and motivate them. And this is the art of Bayesian reasoning about uncertainty, about risk analysis, and so on and so forth. It's a science, and it's a science which is nowadays being used in Dutch courts, I would add. Dutch judges are loath to combine pieces of weak evidence and know how to decide if together they make strong evidence or not. The Netherlands Forensic Institute now has a department which actually does that. It does those calculations. And it can combine mobile phone location data and poor DNA data and smudged fingerprint and come out with what is the weight of the combined weight of evidence of those three or more pieces of evidence. And they can do that in a scientific way, which means to say an objective way, which can be written down and discussed and debated and agreed on or disagreed on, using real knowledge of the world and using real data and so on and so forth. And I've actually been asked to be, you could say, an expert for the defense in a couple of cases in the Netherlands where such combining evidence in a Bayesian way has been performed scientifically by the Netherlands Forensic Institute, by qualified scientists who publish on this, whose work is, peer-reviewed, and it's now used in court, and other experts are called by the defense or proposed by the defense or just proposed by the judges to verify these arguments from a scientific point of view. And I've been called to do that a couple of times, and I wasn't paid anything for it. It was a pleasure to do it, and I wrote my objective points of agreement and disagreement, my qualms, if there were any, and my the small print remarks. In a report, reporting on the scientific veracity of the report of that department of the Netherlands Forensic Institute. Now, I actually happen to know those people. They're great people, but I'm not scared to disagree with them on scientific issues, not at all. And of course, I have to. That's what I'm. If I were being paid, that's what I was being paid. What I would have been paid for. But I'd do it out of love and scientific interest. This is an interesting thing to do, and of course I am motivated to further the cause of objective scientific reasoning about uncertainty in criminal courts. It's already happening in civil courts. Civil court judges are used to deciding issues on the balance of the probabilities. Right? They don't have. It doesn't have to be beyond reasonable doubt. It's just they determine things on the balance of probabilities. And if it's a question of costs being divided between two parties, they will also divide those costs or benefits according to their probabilities. This is what Dutch civil judges now routinely do. And of course, the more they do it, the better they get at doing it. And I've been an expert in a case like that also. And I agreed with the judge. The judge himself disagreed with the prosecution. Because, there was, it was like the tax office versus a private individual. So, and in a civil court, these are two private legal entities, and it's a civil court. But I would I would basically consider the Netherlands tax office as being the state, the prosecution. It's not exactly an equal balance when the weight of the Netherlands tax machine is put against an individual who may have done something naughty or dubious, but I still think they should be treated fairly. And actually I agreed with the judge that the tax office was being unreasonable according to how certain amount of damages should be attributed and who should pay what. I felt that the judge was reasonable, and the tax authorities were being very unreasonable. Well, in view of recent scandals in the Netherlands involving tax and illegal activities of officers of the taxation business, one does not need to. One should not believe that the tax authorities are entirely. Well, they could be honest, but they could not be. It could be they're not telling you the whole truth. They can also be incompetent, and they have conflicts of interest. I mean, tax officers have interests, especially when they take a case to the court. Enormous interest of reputation, status. Okay, so now I went on much too long, and now I will press the stop button at 47 minutes and 45 seconds.